There's a man who's not feeling too well, so he goes to the doctor's. And the doctor's going from room to room, rushing around. And the man's sitting there waiting for his turn. The doctor comes into the room, rifles through a couple pieces of papers, and looks at him very quickly and says, "Don't worry, I have full confidence you'll make it to 85. The man's face drains of color as the doctor leaves the room, and he whispers to the nurse, "I am 85. And the doctor shouts from across the room, "I told you so!" We're coming up to Purim, and Purim Torah is funny teaching, funny thoughts around Judaism and Torah. And this is a Purim where we're not so sure if we're feeling up to laughing or if we're a little bit afraid or not. So this morning we're going to talk a little bit about that fear, because it is a theme which comes again and again, both in our Torah reading a little bit, and especially in the Megillat Esther. There's a question always around, is this fear justified or not? Am I supposed to feel this way, or am I overreacting? In fact, that is, I would say, one of the main questions facing us right now. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the Commonwealth, rather the former Orthodox chief rabbi of the Commonwealth, taught that when we were in Egypt, it was proper for the Egyptians to have a fear of the Jewish community living amongst them. He looks at the history and says the Egyptians had just suffered in the hands of the Hyksos. They had just lost a war because of a third column living in Egypt. And when the Egyptians were afraid of the Jewish people, that fear was based on past experience of other peoples living amongst them. And they had a reason to do what they did. But Amalek, the Amalekites, is a different story. The Amalekites saw a people walking in front of them in the desert, marching, a group of refugees, and just saw the other, just saw people that were not like themselves, and fell upon the poor and the weak in the back, not because of any legitimate concern of who these people were walking through, but because fear was the governing factor, the governing force. In Rabbi Sacks's composition of these scenes, Amalek becomes the paradigm for those who hate for no reason, who are the root, the Amalekites in Jewish tradition, of anti-Semitism, based in xenophobia, and eventually which manifests itself in blood libels and anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist tropes. And so we work to blot out Amalek. And when we say that, one of the things that we are saying is we are working to blot out within ourselves baseless fear. When we look at Rabbi Sacks's picture, he points and says there is legitimate fear based on history, and there is fear that is building and growing inside of us without reason. While I would say that really, if we were to be honest with ourselves, there's always both. There's always the fear based on experience, and if we look at our unconscious biases, there's always the fear which is within us of the other, no matter how hard we try to ignore it. As Rabbi Splansky referred to in the Torah study, there's a lot of meaning based on clothing and attitude that is hidden within our Megillah. There's two characters that we're going to focus on this morning. One is Mordechai, and the other is Esther. We could also talk about Vashti and clothing as well, but all to say that Vashti is, of course, the first feminist hero in our Megillah. But we're, for the sake of talking about the Jewish people in this context, going to focus on Mordechai and Esther. It says in the Megillah, when Mordechai learned all that had happened, when he learned about the decree against our people, Mordechai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, right? He went into mourning and put on sackcloth and ashes. He went through the city crying out loudly and bitterly until he came in front of the palace gates, for one could not enter the palace gate wearing sackcloth. And in every province that the king's command and decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Everybody lay in sackcloth and ashes. Everyone except for Esther, who was, of course, within the palace, who was in a place and a position where she didn't think she needed to fear. When Esther's maidens and eunuchs came and informed her, the queen was agitated. What was she agitated about? Mordecai's clothing. She sent clothing for Mordecai to wear so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he refused. Esther said, "This fear is unfounded." What happens next? Mordecai comes and says to her, actually, no. There's a decree coming against us, against the Jewish people. He says, don't imagine that you of all the Jews will escape with your life, being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained this royal position for just such a crisis. And so Esther hears those words, something changes inside of her. She realizes that the fear being expressed is worth listening to. And she calls for fasting around Shushan for all of the Jewish community and says, I will go to the king. V'chasher avadati, avadati. If you look up there, the third little vignette over, right, we have all of our different holy days portrayed around us in different symbolism hidden here, and in our 1938 concrete poured construction of our building. And by the way, all the Israelis come here and point at it and laugh a little bit. And we'll go into that in a second. You see the words of Queen Esther, words of great faith. V'chasher avadati avadati, and if I am to perish, then I am to perish. Right? Then, if this is the end for me, this is the end for me. These words, which are enshrined in our sanctuary, because they are words of bravery, of faith before God, of standing up and saying, if no one else will do it, then I will, no matter the consequences. And so, on the third day after the fasting, Esther dresses in royalty and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, facing the king's palace while the king was sitting in his royal throne. And the king, of course, allows her to come in, and we're saved. Sorry, I ruined it for tomorrow, for Monday night, but I know everyone knew we were going anywhere with the story. It's okay. V'chasher avadati avadati, which in its context, and for the Jews here at Holy Blossom Temple who didn't speak Hebrew in their daily lives, an expression that has great meaning. However, we had the reason Israelis come in, and we've had many guests come in and say, Rabbi, it's funny that it's up there, no? Because in modern Hebrew, it means, and if I die, I die. So what? Right? A different take on fear. And the kasher avadati avadati, right? If that's the end, that's the end. Right? Referring to the little fears of daily life. And these words, which have such meaning, can come across either way. Either as a statement of faith in Esther's mouth, or they can mean, why bother, right? If it happens, it happens. Mordechai, who moments ago was standing there in sackcloth and in mourning, in the section of the Megillah that we have in our Chumashim, in a few scenes later, Haman is impaled, and Mordechai leaves the king's presence in royal robes of blue and white, thematic colors for the Jewish people, with a magnificent crown of gold and a mantle of fine linen and purple wool. Mordechai is dressed, for those that were listening carefully to Adam's beautiful chanting, Mordechai is dressed like the high priest. Nachmanides and others say that there is meaning in the fact that Mordechai goes from a place of mourning to a place of royalty and priesthood with the Jewish people. The modern commentator and teacher at our Leo Beck College, the Rabbinical School in London, writes, Aaron's clothing, so richly described here, must have been incredibly heavy to wear and hot in the desert. All the symbolic weight of the vestments were made sensible to him physically. The garments reinforced his separateness and holiness, both to himself as well as those who would see him. We too put on clothes as costumes, armor, representations of ourselves and the roles we play, or that which we aspire to. Socially recognized appropriate clothes make it easier to gain recognition and respect, which help us to function in our daily lives. The right outfit lets us, in an English idiom that is surely not accidental, to put on our dignity. We wear our dignity. And then, on Purim, we deliberately take off our dignity and dress to be ridiculous. We wear inappropriate clothing, crossing genders and species, times and stations, fiction and reality. Dressing up as someone else helps us embrace the spirit and spirits of Purim. Our clothing shapes how we see ourselves and how we behave. There is fear around us. Some of that fear is justified and some is not. And we must always try to dress and put on the face of responsibility. We can make some light jokes about it this Purim, because they're funny. But we must always try to be responsible, with it. And in this space where we're not sure whether our fear is justified or not, where we're this place of Esther, who isn't sure if this is real or not, we still must dress with responsibility and wash our hands. We should wash our hands, keep calm, carry on as much as possible, and some of us might give blood, not because it's relevant, because it's a setup for my final joke. I want you to picture this with me. A priest, a rabbit, and a minister walk into a blood bank. They all start talking about blood types. And the rabbit raises her hand and says, "I'm the type O." Shabbat Shalom. And as we now greet each other, live long and prosper.